For our first meeting, we had receivers, participants from all over the globe. In Frankfurt, I'd like to welcome everybody who's here in attendance. The theme of our meeting today, Hands Off Syria, Stop the Imperialist Warmongers. It's a very current and burning theme, and I'm very pleased to introduce Peter Schwarz. He's the editor of the German editorial board and a leading member of the executive of the German Socialist Equality Party. I want to make a few points about how we will proceed. I'd ask everybody who's here in attendance in Frankfurt to switch off their handys, and after the contribution from Peter Schwarz, we'll have a question and answer session. It's possible for those outside Frankfurt to post questions, comments at the end of the report. We will have an initial round and then answers, and we will think about having a second round. And then at a certain point we will finish the transmission, and there's the possibility for further discussion here in Frankfurt. For our international participants, I'd like to advise you, right at the top of your screen, comment. There's the comment, and there you can post your comments. A short introduction. There have been dramatic changes in world developments which required us to change the theme of our meeting. An imperialist crime is being prepared against Syria, and it demonstrates that we were quite correct to react and put the question of Syria at the center of our meeting. The historical significance of this development is at the heart of the contribution. The World Socialist website has shown that the moves towards war is based directly on the crisis of capitalism. What we will investigate in addition is the position of various political tendencies, in particularly the pseudo-left in this country and in other countries. In Germany, the 1st of September is a traditional anti-war day. But it was characteristic that there was a very poor attendance at these anti-war demonstrations, and this reflects the development which has taken place in these pseudo-left tendencies. Now I'd like to introduce Peter Schwarz to give the main report. Today's meeting takes place on a historic date. On September 1st, 1939, This is exactly 74 years ago. The German Wehrmacht invaded the much more inferior military power of Poland, ushering in the most destructive war in recent history. In the course of the next 5.5 years, 80 million people were killed on the battlefields of World War II, through the bombing of entire cities and in the gas chambers of the concentration camps. Europe was turned into a field of rubble. Now the US is planning a similar crime in alliance with France, Germany, and other countries. It may soon be the case that cruise missiles, bombs are raining down on Damascus and other Syrian cities. The attack on defenseless Syria threatens to transform the entire Middle East into an inferno, which could easily develop into a military confrontation with Russia, China, and trigger a Third World War. Hitler justified his attack on Poland with a brazen propaganda lie, and SS commando troop faked an attack on the Gleiwitz radio station near the German border, which then served as the pretext for the invasion. Prior to the attack, Hitler told his generals, "The triggering of the conflict will be done by suitable propaganda. Its credibility is immaterial. Victory proves who is right." The justification for the attack on Syria was no less brazen and dishonest. The declaration made by US Secretary of State John Kerry to the public on Friday was a tissue of lies, hypocrisy, and distortions. "I'm not asking you to take my word for it," he said, Kerry. "Read for yourselves the evidence from thousands of sources." But then everything he offered were claims without any proof. We know this appeared 24 times in his speech, in his short speech, without producing any verifiable proof. Ten years ago, the US Secretary of State at that time, Colin Powell, made a similar speech to the UN General Assembly. For 2 hours, he presented photographs, graphics, tape recordings that allegedly proved that the Iraqi ruler Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. All of this turned out to be lies and forgeries. Its sole purpose was to construct a pretext for the Iraq war, which had been prepared and agreed long before. Unlike Powell, Kerry has not made the slightest effort to produce documents. He simply demands that one believes everything he and the US intelligence agencies have to say. He claimed without a shred of justification, "We've come to the conclusion that the opposition has not used chemical weapons." In fact, the opposition has been proved to possess chemical weapons. This spring, Carla Del Ponte, a leading member of the UN Commission, declared there was strong evidence for the use of chemical weapons by the so-called rebels. In Turkey, members of the Syrian opposition have been arrested in possession of chemical weapons. The rebel opposition, which is financed financed, armed, and trained by the imperialist powers and reactionary Gulf monarchies, are despised by the Iraqi people because of their brutality. This opposition has undergone numerous military defeats in recent months, and they have much more reason than the government to provoke imperialist intervention through the use of poison gas. At a point shortly before the Assad regime allowed UN inspectors back into the country, the most influential of the opposition forces is the Al-Nusra Front. It's a member of Al-Qaeda, and it has repeatedly proven that it is capable of massacres of civilian citizens. In the internet, there are videos where they commit atrocities in front of live cameras against unbelievers or the heretics. Makes very clear what elements are involved in these so-called rebels. The alleged gas attack is in fact only the excuse, the pretext. It's not the reason for the war against Syria. So far, no one has explained how the bombardment of a country can protect the civilian population against such atrocities. On the contrary, a war would demand countless more civilian casualties, exacerbate the civil war, and draw in the surrounding countries. If you want to find out the causes of a war, it's always necessary to distinguish between the apparent and the actual reasons for the war. To understand these real reasons for the war, one has to examine its historical, economic, and social background. Wars are never the result of chance or the mere caprice of evil individuals. They are the result of irresolvable social contradictions and reflect definite social interests. Hitler persecuted the Second World War, carried out the Second World War, sharing many of the same aims as Emperor William I. The German bourgeoisie developed late in its historical development. It required markets, commodities, and as Hitler said, living space. As Trotsky once said, German capitalism as the most advanced capitalist system in the conditions of the European impasse. Hitler was able to subordinate all the resources of the country to prepare for war. And he controlled a fascist movement which could be used to crush the organized working class, which would have opposed the war. This was why he was able to rely on the support of broad sections of the ruling class, the economy, the military, and the state bureaucracy. And in 1933, Hitler was able to take power based on these support from these layers. Let's return to Syria. The media and political parties share a sort of universal conscious forgetfulness. They act as if the question was who, when, and where was responsible for the poison gas attack. The fact that this is now the fourth war in the Middle East following Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya within 12 years, this is ignored. Every one of these previous creeks were justified with similar propaganda and lies as the current Syrian war. In every case, it was argued it was about the overthrow of brutal dictators, defending human rights and democracy. In Afghanistan, the media declared it was an issue of destroying the terror Al-Qaeda network, and now they're lining up the imperialists with Al-Qaeda to oppose the regime in Syria. In every one of these wars, hundreds of thousands have been killed and millions forced to flee their country. The occupation troops, which were supposed to liberate the people, have used torture and terror to intimidate the people. The names Abu Ghraib, Fallujah, Kunduz have become symbolic for fearful war crimes. The consequences of these wars have turned living conditions in these countries to hellish conditions. Nobody, based on these experiences, can now claim that a bombardment of Syria would protect the people against a bloodthirsty dictator. In the preparation for this lecture, I read some of the articles and statements which the World Socialist website has wrote 10 years ago on the Iraq War. They underline how important it is to see the Syrian war in connection with the previous wars in the Middle East. We already predicted that Syria would be the next target for war on the part of the US. On January 7th, 2003, 2.5 months before the beginning of the Iraq War, Washington's aim is not the disarming of Iraq or even the removal of Saddam Hussein, but rather the occupation of the country and the seizure of its oil fields. Then we wrote, the same rationale that underlies the war against Iraq will inevitably lead to wars against Iran, Syria, and other countries in the region. The US drive to dominate the world's oil supplies will lead to increasingly fierce conflicts with more powerful nations. A US conquest of Iraq will initiate a process whose ultimate outcome will be a third world war. Ten years later, it's clear that this prediction has been completely realized. In order to understand the attempts by the US to control the oil resources of the world, it's necessary to look back to the year 1991 and the collapse of the Soviet Union. The US had emerged from the Second World War as the most powerful power in the world. The existence of the Soviet Union the Chinese Revolution and the struggles for independence in the colonial countries set definite limits on the possibilities for maneuver on the part of the US. The dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 overcame these limitations. At that time, we wrote on the world website, the collapse of the Soviet Union was interpreted by the American ruling elite as an opportunity to implement a sweeping imperialist agenda that had been impossible in the aftermath of World War II and during nearly a half-century of Cold War. Proclaiming the arrival of a unipopular moment, the United States set out to prevent, as a principal strategic objective, the emergence of another power, whether a newly unified Europe, Japan, or potentially China that might challenge its dominant international position. This was written in 2003 at the time of the Iraq War. The US at this time was still the most important economic power. But powerful rivals emerged in Europe, in Asia, particularly in China. Now the Americas acquired a larger mountain of external debt, and at the same time the social contradictions in America are growing continually. Up until the mid-70s, the American governments had a relatively liberal foreign policy based on multilateral institutions, combined with some social reforms in domestic policy. This changed with the presidency of Ronald Reagan at the beginning of the 1980s. Reagan combined tax cuts for the rich with massive attacks on social gains and attacks on the working class. The consequence of this development means that the US now belongs to one of the most unequal countries in the world. The richest 1% of society controls over a third of social wealth. The top 10%, 2/3 of the social wealth. The bottom half of the population have less than 5%. The many wars fought by the US since the collapse of the Soviet Union were aimed at overcoming these deficits in the development of American. And there are also parallels in this respect to in 2003 we wrote, when Germany went to war in 1914 and 1939, it did so not only to conquer new sources of raw materials, new markets, and more living space. War was also a means to escape its domestic crisis. In 1939, Hitler had no option left but war. The US is in a similar situation today. The unanimity displayed by the ruling elite, including leading Democrats, in uniting behind Bush, is an expression of their political desperation. They need a war because they have no answer to this economic and social problems tearing American society apart. The Middle East is not only of central significance in the struggle for world domination, due to the fact that 50% of all oil reserves lie in the region, and above all, American rivals China and Asian countries are reliant on these reserves. At the same time, geostrategically, the region is regarded as a key to the control of Central Asia, which is also of central significance for China and Russia. In a commentary on the World Socialist website, we refer to the theories of the imperialist geostrategist Sir Alfred Mackinder from the late 19th and early 20th century, who declared that control of the European region was the key to world domination. These theories are once again being discussed and winning influence. Recently, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung published an article by an historian, Hans Christoph Kraus, which expressly drew on the work of Marx. The title was, "And You Think It's About a Dictator?" He wrote the following: "The aim of the Americans and the Western camp is not primarily to help the regrettable Syrian population, but to take influence on the reorganization of the country after the foreseeable downfall of the present regime, even though they have collaborated quite well in the past. At stake are several long-planned oil and gas pipelines that are important for the West. They will connect Saudi Arabia and Qatar with the Eastern Mediterranean and Turkey, and lead partially through Syrian territory." He then writes, Kraus, "Russians and Chinese maintain the opposite perspective. The Russian Mediterranean military basis at the Syrian port of Taurus is at stake as well, as is the general strategic position of Moscow and Peking in the Middle Eastern and Near Eastern region. A possible military conflict between Israel and Iran makes it indispensable for the two biggest powers of Asia to be present in the region." For these historians, it was already clear last summer that at stake in Syria was domination of the Middle East and, in the final analysis, the Eurasian conflict. The Syrian conflict is only the prelude to a conflict with Iran, and finally Russia and China. Already in January 1991, that's to say before the final dissolution of the Soviet Union, the US conducted its first war against Iraq under President George Bush Sr. But the Bush Sr. Held back from sending troops directly to Baghdad, following a whole number of wars, including smaller wars, including Yugoslavia. They then followed the war against Afghanistan. It was justified on the basis that Afghanistan was giving shelter to Al-Qaeda and those responsible for the terror attacks in New York and Washington. These attacks on the 9th of September were used as a pretext for the America to begin its military offensive. There are many indications that the American security agencies were involved or had very deep, profound knowledge over the plans of Al-Qaeda and his organization. Since then, the so-called war against terror has been used as a pretext for a continuous attack on democratic rights and a continuous escalation of militarism. The US Secret Services have taken upon themselves to kidnap, torture, and imprison suspects. So-called terrorists are arrested all over the world, including American citizens, and they have also been murdered with the use of drones. In the US, a police state has emerged, ruled over by the Ministry for Homeland Security, which makes Orwell's 1984 look like a kindergarten. The American Secret Services conduct their surveillance in the US and follow billions of communications worldwide. Whistleblowers such as Edward Snowden, Bradley Manning, and Julian Assange, who uncover the criminal conduct of the intelligence agencies, are threatened with jail or even the death sentence. Since the Iraq War 10 years ago, two world events have changed developments fundamentally. The financial crisis of 2008 and the Egyptian revolution of 2011. The financial crisis revealed the rottenness of world capitalism. For years, criminal, speculative crimes had led to the development of a financial bubble. The bursting of this bubble threatened to plunge the world economy into the abyss. Governments reacted by awarding the banks trillions. This has enabled the financial swindlers to intensify their activities under conditions where the social attacks have increased. Mass unemployment has risen dramatically, and living standards across the world have sunk. The world economy finds itself in the greatest crisis since the Great Depression. and no solution is in sight. This is one of the most important reasons for the preparations for war against Syria. The WSWS wrote on August 29th, the Great Depression of the 1930s led to World War II as the imperialist powers sought to find in war a solution to the maladies of capitalism. The Great Recession that began in 2008, which shows no signs of abating, is leading to World War III. The forms of economic parasitism associated with the processes of global financialization, in which the enrichment of a small stratum of society is achieved through swindling on a massive scale, finds its natural complement in a foreign policy that realizes its objectives through criminal violence. In 2011, the uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt revealed that the working class had returned to the historical stage. The mass uprisings, which led to the overthrow of the Tunisian President Ben Ali and his Egyptian counterpart Mubarak, unleashed shock for the ruling classes across the globe. They were only able to bring these rebellions under control with the help of well-heeled representatives of the pseudo-left. While these forces expressed sympathy for the revolution at the start, but then they lined up with the military when they realized that the working class was serious in its demands. This led to the military putsch in Egypt, which was directed less against the Muslim Brothers, rather it opposed a new emergence of the revolution. The bloody repression by the military, however, does not mean the end of the revolution. It's the prelude to social explosions which will take place all over the world, also in Europe and America. The explosive social tensions, the opposition, the mass opposition to war within the population, and the explosive combinations of former wars in the Middle East. This has led to a profound crisis within the British and the American bourgeoisies. Just a few days ago, it seemed certain that the US would be able to win a coalition of the willing to bomb Syria. But now last week, the British Premier David Cameron was prevented from participating by his own parliament. And now Obama has made a move to war dependent on discussions in America which would take place only at the end of the first week of September. Although he's not obliged to, President Obama announced, surprisingly, last evening that Congress should decide over such a decision. If Obama were to be defeated in such a vote, then it could lead to a government crisis similar to that in Great Britain. The ruling elites are deeply divided. They fear they could be drawn into a conflict which runs completely out of control. Above all, they fear fierce reaction in their own country. In Gross Britannia, according to polls, just between 6 and 11% of the population support an attack on Syria, under conditions where former Labour Prime Minister Tony Blair drew Britain into war based on lies. There's a profound mistrust within the population against the government and its declarations. Equally in America, another war is opposed by masses of the population. It would be wrong to think, however, that the decisions by Cameron and Obama represent any sort of life force within bourgeois democracy. In fact, it's quite the opposite. They're making a temporary retreat in order to consolidate their ranks and create conditions where they can better prepare for a confrontation with Iran, Russia, and China. And they're withdrawing also to be better able to confront their own domestic populations. The New York Times wrote the following about the motives of Obama to transfer a decision on war to Congress. The paper writes on Obama's discussion with his advisors. In a 2-hour meeting of passionate, sharp debate in the Oval Office, Obama told them after a frantic week in which he seemed to be rushing towards a military attack on Syria, he wanted to pull back and seek congressional approval first. He had several reasons, he told them, including a sense of isolation after the terrible setback in the British Parliament. But the most compelling one may have been that acting alone would undercut him if in the next 3 years he needed congressional authority for his next military confrontation in the Middle East, perhaps with Iran. If he made the decision to strike Syria without Congress now, he said, would he get Congress when he really needed it? One couldn't be clear that it's not a situation of any sort of withdrawal or retreat on Obama's purpose. And the whole issue of poison gas and who is behind the poison gas, this isn't the question at all. The ruling class is in a profound crisis, but this makes them not less aggressive, but rather forces them to conduct their war and plans for dictatorship with even more energy. All wings of the ruling elite have gone sharply to the right following the economic crisis in the past 5 years. This applies particularly in Europe. Let's look at France. 10 years ago, the conservative government of Jacques Chirac opposed the Iraq War. It did this not on the basis of pacifism, but because it hoped better to be able to defend French interests independently from the US. Today, the socialist president François Hollande is one of the most loyal supporters of the US. One day after the British Parliament voted against a military intervention, Hollande announced in the daily paper Le Monde his continuing support for a military attack. In the case of Germany, which rejected the Iraq war in 2003 and abstained in the vote for the Libyan war in 2011, now Chancellor Merkel has assured President Obama of a complete political support. Due to the current election campaign, she didn't want to make concrete obligations regarding of a military nature. The leading candidate of the SPD, Steinbrück, supported Merkel immediately. The German government says that such a crime against humanity as a poison gas attack must have consequences. I agree. The Greens are also demanding sharp criticism and concrete consequences. The former 68 radical, Daniel Cohn-Bendit, has explicitly called for German participation in the preparations of a military attack. He's written, "The West must mobilize its military as a condition for either a military attack or enforce a treaty and stopping the bloodletting. The German government must participate in the preparation of military action together with other EU countries." This is not even a demand at the moment from the CDU, from the conservative CDU. The clearest expression of this turn to the right is to be found in petty bourgeois pseudo-left tendencies. Now, amongst their ranks, imperialism can find its most reliable support. The German Left Party, and in particular groups inside it, pseudo-left groups inside it, such as Marx 21 and Socialist Alternative, SAV, they've played a key role in strengthening the pro-imperialist Syrian opposition. Already last December, the Left Party supported a resolution along with leaders of the government, the SPD and the Greens. It was an appeal with the call, Syria, freedom requires assistance. One of the first supporters of the appeal was Katja Kipping, the chair of the Left Party. The General Secretary of the SPD also supported it, Andrea Nahles, the chair of the Greens, Claudia Roth, and the chairman of the Foreign Policy Committee in the German Parliament, Rupert Polenz, who's CDU. The Left Party operates as an extended arm of the German Foreign Ministry and uses its close contacts to the Syrian opposition to advance the interests of German imperialism. In recent months, it's used a series of conference and podium discussions, all held under the label of peace initiative and calling for a political solution, but in fact, they gave a platform for the Syrian rebels, those calling for a military intervention. The section of the Syrian opposition with which the Left Party works most closely are now at the head of the National Syrian Coalition, which is regarded as the legitimate representatives of Syria by the imperialist powers and their regional allies. The two leading figures, Ahmed Yaba on the picture on the right, He belongs to an opposition group headed by Michel Kilo. Kilo is a former Stalinist and Syrian dissident who's been systematically promoted by the Left Party in the past 2 years. Kilo has spoken at a whole number of meetings of the Left Party and the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, run by the Left Party, and writes regularly for the Left Party newspaper Neues Deutschland und Junge Welt. Currently, the Left Party is posing as an opponent of the war. Its attempt to cover up its own tracks because it wants to stop a genuine anti-war movement which could threaten the working class. In fact, the Left Party plays the same cynical role in the war question as in social question. In the election campaign, it complains and opposes Parts 4 and social cuts, but when it's in power in state governments and local governments, it imposes these social cuts. Yesterday, there were a whole number of demonstrations against the Syrian war in Germany. The Left Party appeared at a whole number of these demonstrations with leading members, but made no attempt to mobilize their own members for the meetings. They want to keep the opposition to the war under control, but while at the same time ensuring that it doesn't take a mass character. The unified support by all parties for a criminal war against Syria should be taken as a warning. These same parties will use the same brutality and determination to attack the jobs and the social gains of the working class following the election in September. The catastrophic onslaught against social rights and gains carried out in Greece with the support of Germany will then be on the agenda in Germany itself. The struggle against war is irresolvably bound up with the struggle against its roots, the capitalist system. The only force which can stop the warmongers is the working class. The defense of social gains and democratic rights and the struggle against war are all intimately bound together. The only way out of the dead end of capitalism and imperialism is the joint struggle of the international working class for the victory of the socialist world revolution. This is the perspective of the German Socialist Equality Party, the German section of the Fourth International. We call upon all those who wish to prevent a further criminal war to support our election campaign, to read the World Socialist website every day, and to follow our further online meetings. Many thanks, Comrade Peter, for this contribution. Could I ask, are there contributions, questions, comments? A commentary in English. This is from England. We'd like to appeal to our international participants. You can pose questions or make comments. It would be useful if we could have a small group of comments and questions, and we could answer, we could address a cluster of such comments or questions. It appears our international participants need a little bit of time to think before making contributions. This was a question about the participation of the PSG, which is just putting up candidates in 3 German states in the German election. We've agreed at the start of our campaign that the decisive element in our campaign is not the number of votes we win, but to use the particular means and methods which are available to us in the election campaign to propagate our perspective and win support for our party. We have some comments from Bayern, Bavaria. Could the speaker explain why, in contrast to 2003, there is no big anti-war movement at the current time? I'd like to address these questions. They refer to profound changes which has taken place in the past 10 years. 2003, at the start of the Iraq War, there were the biggest protest demonstrations in the history of the world. It's differed, the numbers which appeared on the demonstrations, but it's safe to say that at least 10 million people took to the streets on one day in Europe, in Asia, in the US. I myself participated in a demonstration in Rome There were 3 million, allegedly 3 million on the demonstration. It was impossible to check exactly this figure, but it was a massive participation. Now, the demonstrations which took place in the past 2 days, there were in no case more than a few hundred involved. This does not reflect that there is a lack of opposition to this war within the population. Opinion polls are very clear. I quoted them for Great Britain. In Germany, I saw one opinion poll which said 23% would support a military offensive, and 1/3 of this 23% were opposed to Germany participating in any military attack. The issue is not that there isn't an anti-war sentiment within the broad masses. The problem is that nearly all of the political tendencies which in 2003 took part in the anti-war movement have switched sides in the meantime, and not just on the issue of war. One of the groups at that time in Italy in 2003 was refounded communism, a successor party to the Italian Communist Party. It had played an important role in providing a left cover for various bourgeois governments in Italy, and then in 2005 entered the coalition with Romano Prodi, and then supported war and major attacks on the Italian working class. Now this movement is completely discredited. I spoke about the left party here, how it was significantly involved in preparing the conditions in Syria, which are now being used by the imperialists for new war. 2 years ago, we experienced with the Libya war how the anti-capitalist party in France, the International Socialist SWP, who have their supporters in Germany, were the most important or loudest protagonists for war against Libya. They criticized the imperialist powers for not taking enough military action against Libya. If we do not see this situation just in a negative light. Every revolutionary confrontation, a revolutionary situation involves a clarification of political parties and tendencies. Parties are forced to show their true colors. Many of these organizations called themselves formally socialist or Trotskyist, but they do not embody the interests of the working class. They represent the interests of a well-heeled layer of the middle class, which under conditions of a deepening capitalist crisis regard the working class as an increasing threat to their own privileges, and on this basis line up increasingly with imperialism. There's the example of Christina Buchholz from the Left Party, Marx 21. This is an organization with not more members than ourselves, but now she's carrying out a leading position in the German Defense Committee to give a left cover for the war preparations of the German defense and foreign ministries. This is why there isn't a major demonstrations at the moment. There are a number of questions and commentaries. I found the presentation very good. The combination of the military aggression and the attacks on social rights. All of the media remain silent on the real reasons for the war, and it makes the WSWS essential reading to inform. This is from Max. 2 questions, one from England. What did the media report on the parliamentary vote in Great Britain? Secondly, could you say more about the destabilization of world policies if the US persists in going to war? There are 148 groups participating. Leipzig, Munich, Hamburg, Spain, Holland, Romania, France, England, the US, Australia, Sri Lanka. A further question, should I ask it now? Germany. What stance should a revolutionary socialist take inside Syria itself with regard to the regime? The reports in the German press on the vote in Great Britain, it was restrained. They reported on the extent of the crisis for Cameron. My impression was that many in the ruling elite were relieved because they thought that a war taking place in the last weeks of the election campaign here in Germany could have untold consequences. Neither the governing parties nor the so-called opposition, none of them want to take a clear position on the war question because they're in basic agreement. Therefore, I think they were somewhat relieved that the decision has been delayed. We've described this election campaign as a sort of grand coalition between all of the parties, but it could have been taken other forms if a war had taken place. There was also a question, the international consequences of a future war. As far as I read the situation, Obama has postponed the war, but is still determined to carry it out, and he will attempt to win a majority in favor of intervention in Congress. It's necessary to follow very closely how this develops, but on the basis of many reactions, it's clear that the conflict with Russia will intensify. The press tends to identify the figure of Putin as a nationalist who's not prepared to uh, negotiate, but this in fact he's ready to make all sorts of deals, and also with the US and with other imperialist powers. As I tried to show previously, and this article by Fisk makes it clear, there are fundamental conflicts and contradictions here. Russia can't permit that a new war begins in Middle East, which is quite clearly directed not just against Syria but also against Iran. This would lead to tectonic shifts, that it would make it difficult to achieve a compromise. And all of these conflicts will be intensified should such a war begin. But in the last few days, for example, China has spoken out very strongly against an aggression against Syria. With regard to the question what stance should one take as a socialist to the government in Syria? We're not supporters or defenders of the al-Assad regime, just as we were not supporters of Gaddafi or Saddam Hussein, but this is not the issue. The overthrow of these regimes is the task of the working class and imperialist powers. All those who declare that with the help of the imperialist powers it will be possible to make a turn towards democracy in these countries ignores 150 years of history and experience. Imperialist powers do not intervene in these countries to establish democracy. They do it to defend and extend their own interests. And these interests are irreconcilable with the broad interests of the masses. Those, such as Kilo, the friend of the Left Party, who declare the imperialists would fight for democracy. The same figures that appear on talk shows in German television, they represent a very specific social layer. With regard to Egypt, we've written about this development. Many of these figures work for NGOs, for Western institutions. They represent a privileged middle class layer inside very poor countries. And they hope that a regime imposed by imperialism will defend their privileges. They're often studied in foreign universities. I won't say all of them are recruited by the intelligence agencies, but some of them have undoubtedly been. And these are the forces posing as defenders of democracy, the only force which can defend democracy and advance democracy in Syria is the working class. This struggle for democracy is necessary for the working class to overcome their poverty. In Egypt, one could see how the demands and aspirations of the working class came into conflict with these layers of the middle class who then became defenders of brutal military measures by an army supported by the US. The task of socialists in Syria is to fight for the building of the Fourth International, an international organization of the working class, for the realization of the perspective of the permanent revolution. And that democracy can only be fought for by the working class in these countries. There are a whole number of questions, commentaries. This is the participant who asked the last question. He says, thank you for the very clear answer to my question on the position of socialists in Syria. Thank you very much for the very informative meeting. This is from an international participant. It was very important. I send you my compliments from the other side of the world. "30 years ago, the NATO began a campaign against Bosnia on the basis of a similar pretext. There are 3 questions relating to the role of the left and pseudo-left. Could you say more about the pseudo-left and trade unions in Syria? There are 2 similar questions. I comment from Manchester. The British SWP in Great Britain is saying that this vote in the House of Commons was a victory for the working class. Question was more information about the role of the pseudo-left on Syria. I don't know in detail what tendencies are involved in the among Syrian political parties. We followed it closely here from Germany and in Europe, but the way in which the so-called Syrian opposition was built up, there was an organization called Adopt a Revolution. They collected money for this opposition, built up links for the Syrian opposition, and basically the line of this organization, and this applies also to the Left Party, they sought to present a movement which was very deliberately and consciously built up by the imperialist powers as a sort of expression of the revolution. to see this in connection, or in contrast to the developments in Tunisia and Egypt, where you had a mass movement in Libya. The imperialists took up the initiative at the start to build up opposition movements. In Benghazi, we wrote about this development. There were representatives of the CIA. These forces were brought together in Libya, together with Islamist forces. And it's a similar development inside Syria. The role of these pseudo-lefts is to present this whole charade as an expression of a revolutionary movement against the Assad government. These were never independent movements in Libya and Syria. There is a question from Berlin. Berlin. Do we know more about the background of this Michel Kilo? There are more people participating than I said previously. We know there are participants from Russia. There's a rhetorical question regarding the Turkish government. Sarin gas was found in Turkey, close to the border with Syria. It pointed to Syrian forces with poison gas uh, on Turkish territory, and we'd like to propose at this point that we terminate the international internet meeting, and we'll continue the discussion here in Frankfurt. I'd like to thank everybody who took place from across the globe and also here in Germany. I'd like all those who are taking part for the first time to establish contact with our parties in America, in Great Britain, in Sri Lanka, and also here in Germany, to make contact with us and support our current election campaign here in Germany. Many thanks.